Hello and welcome to episode 54 of the Motivational Millennial Podcast. I am Ivy LeClaire.
And I am Blake Brandis.
And today is a bit of a unique style of episode. It is our season 1 finale. So we are going to just take some time to share a little bit about the ways that we've grown in the first year of doing the podcast, around the podcast, but also just in other areas of our life and in business. And we want to do that around a certain theme, and the theme is vulnerability. And ironically, I feel like right now this recording is really vulnerable for me because I'm thinking about how I really want this episode to be like a bomb-ass episode because this is the last one that you all are going to hear for a while. And so I'll just name that right now when we start.
You gotta name it to tame it.
I gotta name it to tame it. So vulnerability and authenticity have been actually a pretty ever-present theme through the podcast, and not only in the way that our guests have shown up and shared so much about their personal selves and their journeys as they've been growing toward their dreams, but also in terms of our own lives and the way that we've grown as a business. I have this great quote from Brené Brown about what vulnerability is, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about if you haven't already figured that out of all the times we've mentioned it. But the quote is, "Vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they are never weakness." And I think that's an incredibly important point and distinction to make because in our culture, we often associate vulnerability with being weak, right? Like that our vulnerabilities are our weaknesses, right? But one of the things that Brené Brown and other researchers and teachers in this realm talk about is that actually the more vulnerable you are, the more you put down your shields and your guards of perfectionism and all of these other things, the stronger that you actually get. Because you can see that you experience this vulnerability and you come out of it being okay, being stronger. Like it may be hard. I don't know. What do you think about vulnerability, Blake?
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental reimagining of who we are as humans when we talk about vulnerability as strength versus weakness. Because vulnerability as weakness presupposes that we're victims. And so being vulnerable means we're in danger, we are not capable of handling whatever challenges arise. But looking at vulnerability as strength is really saying that we as people are whole and empowered and that we don't have to be perfect all the time to make an impact. And we don't have to meet everyone's expectations to still be enough in this world. So I really like the idea of vulnerability as strength because it taps into something that we've been exploring both on the show and through our motivational speaking work in schools and elsewhere, which is this idea that you can choose the story you tell yourself about what things mean in your life. And so we've all had struggles and we've all had difficulties. And rather than those being things we sweep under the carpet, when we share them, people can really see us and acknowledge us for who we are and feel seen because they say, yes, I resonate with that. That has happened to me or someone I know or someone I care about. And I think that's really powerful.
So how has vulnerability shown up for you when doing the podcast or since we started doing the podcast?
I think it's manifested for me in recognizing how many assumptions I make and how many times I feel the need to be confident. And when I reflect on it later, I learn something when I can let myself not be perfect in that confidence. And I'll give you a specific example because that's pretty abstract. So early on in the podcast, when I was trying to help expand or follow up on a question that someone said, I would imagine two potential scenarios about what they had just said. So I'd ask a question like, so was your experience like this or was it more like that? You know, did you feel more focused or more afraid? As if those were the only two options that they could potentially feel. And what I learned upon further reflection was it's much more effective when I didn't assume anything about their experience and ask an open-ended question. So instead of asking, did you feel this or that? I could just ask, how did you feel about that experience, and not project my own assumptions onto people. And so that was vulnerable for me, because part of how I've pushed through a lot of challenges in the past is by using this confidence as a shield, like a forward-facing shield that just sort of says whatever criticisms are going to come, I'll just push them back. And the irony is very few criticisms ever come, but I get so much more growth when I put down the shield and look in the mirror, you know?
Wow, that's so interesting.
So how has vulnerability manifested for you in the process of doing the podcast?
I would say one of the biggest ways that I've grown is that when we first started doing the podcast, I had a huge amount of imposter syndrome, meaning I put everyone that we were going to talk to on this really high pedestal, and I saw myself as really small and like, oh my gosh, who am I to be speaking to these incredible people? And there was this shift partway through when perhaps part of it was around when I started doing coaching, training, and having conversations with people in a different way. But there was a shift that occurred where I started to see people on our podcast as my peers rather than people who were above me. And I think that we all have that level of imposter syndrome to some degree when we start on a path of whatever our career or our profession is. I mean, even people who we would consider famous, they might be comparing themselves to other people who are like even more famous. Sure. and they're having their imposter syndrome. And it's like, it brings out this sense of feeling like people are going to figure out that you don't belong there. Mm-hmm. And it isn't the first time I felt that way in my life, but it's been so amazing to just talk to people, to listen to them, and to meet them from this perspective of support and care. And what I learned is that everybody is so human. Mm-hmm. Everybody is so human. We forget, we get into our heads and we create these stories about ourselves and we isolate ourselves from humanity and others. You know, I just don't like people. And what that does is actually, it makes you feel more isolated and alone because you forget that you are having a shared experience of being human with every other human on the planet. Yeah. And every human, no matter what, is experiencing some type of internal suffering and judgment of self and all of these things. That is just part of the human experience. And so I just think I have now gotten to where I feel so much more comfortable speaking with anybody because I can come to them with an open heart and with love and compassion and seeing myself as an equal and seeing them as an equal. And it just totally has shifted the way that I interact with people.
And that's ironic because that's part of the reason we started the podcast in the first place, was to share with people the human stories and journeys of these phenomenal millennials who are doing meaningful, purposeful work in their life, but who have also had challenges and had those struggles. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really great that through the process we were hoping would help other people recognize that, it's also helped us do the same thing.
Yeah, that's so funny. And it was really vulnerable for me to show up, even when I was feeling small and even when I was feeling scared. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one thing that if you are feeling scared and feeling afraid and feeling like you aren't big enough to be doing whatever it is you're doing, showing off your art or performing a speech or throwing a party or whatever, if you do that thing and you do it once and you do it twice and you do it 3 times, like eventually it just feels totally normal for you. And that myth can be dispelled if you allow it.
Yeah, and I remember us talking about that early on because you were sharing some of those fears and concerns. And I remember there was some comparison in there too, because you were like, Blake, you've been talking to people for so long. And I was like, I used to be super afraid of people too, you know? I used to be scared to answer the phone when I was a kid because I didn't want to have to talk to a stranger. You know, I wanted my parents to talk to somebody for me. And it's only that I kept doing it. And you're right. It's just that I started earlier. And I think that's true for all of us. Anything that we want to do that's hard and challenging. And I think about that for myself and for the things that are at my edge. Facilitating was like that for a while for me. And it still kind of is because you've done a lot more facilitation work than I have. But I just recognize that the only way to get more comfortable and confident and skilled at it is just to do it. There is this whole idea we need to be perfect. We need to be ready. I'm not ready. And the bottom line is the only way to get ready is to do it, and eventually you become ready.
Absolutely. So how has this theme of vulnerability and authenticity shown up in other ways for you over the past year?
One of the things I talked about in the introduction to this podcast, meaning episode 00, was how I didn't want to look at life as a giant to-do list. And part of that was because I had structured my entire life around to-do lists. And one of the things I've started doing recently in the past couple months has been to release my to-do lists. And rather than my life falling apart, ironically, I've been much more confident and comfortable and productive, which is so ironic because that was the thing I was always afraid of would happen if I didn't have a to-do list. And just to test it out, I was recently feeling a little overwhelmed. And so I started to write down all the stuff that I had to do. I thought, no, let me just get it out of my mind and put it on the to-do list. And that definitely sent me into a very unproductive, negative spiral. And I was like, whoa, man, this to-do list thing is crazy. And so that's where I think it's really been a transformative experience for me, and a very vulnerable one, of releasing these guardrails that I thought I needed to have to be successful, like a to-do list. And I still have a calendar, but there's a difference between putting something on a calendar and creating a list of 20 large projects that you have to do that are all overwhelming, especially when considered in aggregate. So,
how do you feel that's a vulnerable process for you?
There's a lot of releasing an expectation that I will do things perfectly and in the perfect order. That was a lot of what a to-do list for me was. It wasn't just about getting all the things I had to do. It was about putting them in the perfect order, in the top priority, in the most effective way. And what I realized was when I started trusting myself, I would make decisions from a place of, this is a very important project. What's the next thing I have to do? And I could just ask myself that question rather than having to consult my list. And the advantage of trusting myself in that process was I would go where my energy was all the time versus, I don't know about this particular task, but it says I need to do that task right now. And that's a great way to get into your head and to get stuck. And so trusting myself has helped me release and just stay in the flow really constantly.
And there can be a lot of vulnerability around trusting yourself.
Sure.
Actually, that's one of the things that's been a major theme for me in a lot of different ways, is trusting myself.
Yeah, can you share more about that?
Yeah, I'd love to, because when I think about vulnerability and authenticity, so many different things come to mind, but it must just be synchronicity or something that you brought that up, because it's really resonating with me right now. I take a deep breath because it feels like a really big topic and a big area of transformation for me when I think about trusting myself. Because trusting myself involves a couple of things. One is knowing how to listen to myself, and then trusting my interpretation of what I'm hearing from my own intuition. For me, it's through intuition and just like sensing and feeling in my body, feeling in my gut. That's how I receive that. So it's listening to myself, but then trusting my interpretation of what I'm hearing, and then acting on that interpretation despite what anybody else thinks. And that's really hard to do, because when you want love and acceptance and appreciation and respect from people who are close to you, your friends, your partners, your family, or people you don't even know, right? Like strangers, like on social media and everything, it's hard to not want that acceptance. We tend to do what other people want us to do, and we also try to get other people's advice in an effort to not make mistakes. So what that looks like in our everyday life or in our business or anything, when we're trying to make a decision, instead of first, like we have the question, do I want to go on this international trip or international vacation? And then you're thinking of all of the pros and cons and worrying about it. But if you take a moment to get centered, to get quiet, to really listen to yourself, and this can take practice, but for me, it's like I can feel it in my gut, what my intuition is telling me to do, despite what my external circumstances are telling me. If you take the time to get to that answer first, before going to other people and just kind of getting their perspective, that can be really beneficial. Or you could just not get other people's perspectives and trust yourself. But what happens is that we have this thought, and then we just go to someone and say, what do you think? We're giving all the responsibility for that decision and everything that we're creating from that decision to other people, because we're afraid that we might make a mistake, and that if we ask enough people and we get enough validation from enough people, that will prevent us from making the mistake. And we know for sure that this is the right way to go. But the thing is that when you really tap into yourself and your own intuition and your own wisdom and trust yourself, you will make decisions that are even greater and even more in alignment with what you want, and create amazing things in your life, because you're not listening to the external circumstances or the naysayers or anything. You're just focused on yourself. So it can be like a way to tap into something way greater than you could ever imagine.
There are about 15 really important points that relate to that. I'm just going to try to list a couple of them that came to mind.
Sure, 15.
So that's really profound for a few reasons. One, there is that quest for certainty. That's why we want all these other people's opinions, right?
Yeah.
We want to not make the mistake, and so we over-invest in other people's decision or advice, because we often think, well, at least if I try it and it fails, I can blame them, right? I don't take ownership over that. Mm-hmm. And another piece that came up for me was a realization that this is what makes us different from robots. And from computers. And what I mean by that is, with a computer, you need a very precise set of instructions to work in a specific sequence or some variation of sequences, or it doesn't work. And humans, we're kind of the opposite. You can logic us all you want, but we're fundamentally emotional creatures. And so what drives us are these emotional decisions that we justify through logic. And that leads me to the final profound point that came from what you just said, which is a realization that I think for a lot of us, especially who have been through significant amounts of formal education, there is this assumption that you should never listen to your intuition. Like, your intuition is just your base self. It's this sort of...
just your base self.
Exactly. I mean, but that's the idea, right? It's like your animal brain, and so it just wants to eat and sleep and have fun. And so it's such a radical notion in some ways to think, you mean my first course of action is not to create a pro and con list and to ask experts for advice? And it's not that you're saying you shouldn't do that, but what you're saying the first thing you should do is tap in, because the irony is you might go through all of that and then realize at the very end of it, when you start listening to yourself, that you didn't want it in the first place. And so you spent all this time going to experts and doing research and getting advice when you didn't want to do it in the first place. And a specific example that comes to mind is a friend of mine who went all the way through med school. He did, biology and chemistry in undergrad. He finished, completed med school. And then, before he practiced as a doctor one day in his entire life, he admitted to himself what he had known probably for a very long time, which is that being a doctor wasn't for him. And that wasn't what he wanted to do with his life. And I say they had known for a long time because when we were talking about it, he said, I'm on a mission now to help other people truly listen to themselves and understand early in the process if this is not what they want to do. And he said, because a lot of us feel we should do it because it's prestigious or because our families expect it of us, or we think it'll give us status and significance. And for some people, that's enough to drive them, and that's good if that works for them. But for a lot of people, they really want something completely different for their life. And so they might go 5, 10, 20 years being woefully unhappy because they didn't listen to themselves.
And I think first of all, I just want to say that was a really vulnerable moment of that person's life. And that's why this is so vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Because, the flip side of that is that you might go through gathering all of these pieces of advice and everybody's ideas about what your life should look like, and they tell you, no, I don't think you should do that thing. And then at the end of it, you still want to do that thing. But now you've created all of this fodder and all these weapons and stuff that your saboteur and inner critic can use to keep you from actually doing that thing. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you get grounded in what it is you really want, which is the only thing that matters, because when you get grounded in that, you get grounded in your connection to infinite wisdom. It's the only thing that really matters. And when you do that and you move forward from that place, you are going to be much more likely to stay focused than if you have all of these crazy opinions in your head. I mean, and this even applies to like marketing, ways that if you own a business or you are trying to sell a service or some kind of product, and all of these different gurus are telling you that you need to do it this exact way, but you just got to trust your instinct. I mean, and that's where the nuance comes in of trusting yourself and the truth of you and the strong wise knowing part that's always within you versus trusting your saboteur voice, which is why that can also be vulnerable. Like, it's a big vulnerable ball to like really trust yourself, because like you said, we're taught not to do that, so that's why it's vulnerable too. Yeah,
and I think there's an important distinction here probably to be made between what you want being the most important thing in terms of life and in terms of the strategy and even in terms of tactics of what you're doing versus what you want being the most important thing in that exact moment. Because I can hear the external critics of millennials saying, oh, well, that's where the entitlement mentality comes in, that millennials feel like whatever they want is the most important thing. And that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is listening to yourself about what you want is important as an inner compass, because you only have your life to live. And so the path that you take, even down to, like you said, like a marketing decision, needs to be, the path you take is strengthened, even if it doesn't work out the way you would want it to, by listening to yourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, we're definitely not talking about what you want in terms of, I want to eat a whole pizza right now.
Right.
We're talking about like,
I want to board first on the airplane, right, even though I'm not, yeah.
We're talking about the deeper level of trusting yourself and getting what you want, like looking at your values, looking at how you're really wanting to create your life. And the more you live within alignment of your values, that stronger you're going to get in multiple different ways. You're saying, even if the outcome isn't exactly what you would picture. I mean, that's part of it, like releasing the outcome too. But yeah, that's so interesting.
That's helpful clarification. Thank you. I didn't feel like I was quite getting it. But what you said, being in alignment with your values, is really what we're talking about. That's a beautiful bottom lining of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else that you would like to share about vulnerability and authenticity before we kind of wrap up our season finale?
Yes. We just edited out 10 seconds of me going to find the other thing I want to talk about. So there's a Tim Ferriss quote that I really wanted to share that ties some of this together. But the quote is, "Your business success is a function of how many uncomfortable conversations you have." And I think that ties into vulnerability, because so often having conversations about the things we love and care about is incredibly vulnerable, because we're declaring to the world, here I am, this is what I care about, these are the people I want to help, this is what I want to offer. And sometimes people are going to say, that's not for me, or I don't care, or you're dumb, or whatever they're going to say in whatever form they say it. And so the secret is to push through that discomfort and just acknowledge that it's going to be uncomfortable. And a lot of the time, it's not going to work. But as Tim notes, the business success, and I would argue the personal fulfillment, comes on the other side of the discomfort. It comes from being willing to show up vulnerably and to do the self-care necessary to keep being vulnerable. That's the other piece of it. You don't have to keep offering yourself up and getting smacked around endlessly without any kind of support. I think quite the contrary. To be able to be that person for the world, you need to have your community, your tribe who supports you. You need to have your personal practices that keep you strong and focused and energized. So that's the other thing I wanted to share. Was there anything else you wanted to share?
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think about this moment in my journey toward building my coaching practice, because I hit a roadblock, in a sense, where I wasn't getting any additional clients and I needed more hours for this certification program. And I was so afraid, I wanted to quit. I wanted to quit because I love coaching so much. I love coaching so much, and I wanted to quit. It sounds so funny, but part of what is vulnerable about pursuing your dreams is the possibility that you may not succeed in the way. I mean, there's that fear, you're afraid you're not going to succeed. And so why start at all, right? It's better to have loved and lost than never have loved at all. And I guess I believe that to be true. But, when you believe the opposite of that, I would just rather not lose it at all. Then that's where self-sabotage can come in and all of these other things. But it can be so vulnerable to care about something like you're talking about. And to care about it, even just for yourself, it can be vulnerable, let alone to talk to other people about how much you care about it. And to stick with it, even when things don't go your way and you're kind of heartbroken by the path. Sticking with it is incredibly brave and strong. Mm-hmm. And it's this is why we want to highlight and encourage this in other people, because if you have your dream and you stick to it and you keep going in the face of all this crazy stuff, you are such a badass, totally a huge badass. And I admire that in people so much. Absolutely. And I think you, wonderful listener of our podcast, should really give yourself a pat on the back right now for whatever you've stuck with. Even if it's just staying alive. I mean, it's hard for a lot of people just internally, let alone with whatever external things you've been going through. So I think it's important to just acknowledge yourself, even though sometimes we're told you shouldn't because that's prideful or that's selfish. But if you can give yourself that pat on the back, it makes it that much easier for you to do it again the next time, versus feeling shame about success. I think is really toxic, because then you're going to constantly be self-sabotaging. And I have seen this in my own life, so that's why I feel comfortable even saying that, because at a certain point we can feel we don't deserve it, or we're hurting other people by being successful, or we're offending a religious ideal or something. And I think quite the contrary. Your success provides a model and a template and hope for other people. And that is certainly worth celebrating. Absolutely. And sometimes success is getting out of bed that day and doing your yeah. And that's a win. Yep. Sometimes it's getting out of bed. Sometimes it's speaking in front of an audience when it's really scary. Sometimes it's putting pen to paper. Yep. That's another really a big win that can also be really vulnerable if you're wanting to write or create in whatever way that you're actually wanting to create. Actually sitting down and doing that creation is a big win as well. Yeah. And even just putting your voice out there. I mean, Ivy and I were just talking before this episode. We wanted to make it so good, and so we were sort of nervous in a way, because we just care about you, and we really appreciate your time and your commitment to being with us, to being with yourself, and to investing in yourself, to become more of the person you want to be, and to have that life that you want to lead. We are so grateful for you listening to this first season and just being here for this journey. I mean, we can't even express how grateful we are adequately, I don't think. Unless we could give you a hug, and that would be pretty cool. That's right. Great. So feel our virtual hug right now. That sounded creepy. It's meant to be loving. That's right. So For season 2, we're going to relaunch in the fall, and we'll keep you all updated, but we're wanting to go through a process of reaching out and speaking to our listeners and really getting a sense of what they like about the current structure, what their favorite parts are, what could be tweaked. We just really want to serve you the most and in the best way possible. And so that's going to be what we do over the next couple of months in preparation for season 2. So it might look a little bit different, it might not, but we're just going to go through this process of making sure that we're creating content that is valuable to you and meaningful to you. So we would love to hear from you. We'll probably send out a survey to the folks that are on our listserv so they have a chance to do that. If you are interested in getting our newsletter, you can get a free gift as a part of that. You can go to our website, motivationalmillennial.com, and sign up for the e-guide, Motivating Your Millennial Mind, and that will add you to the newsletter, and you'll also get that free gift from us, which is a pretty good chunk of perspective and wisdom there. Also, if you just want to reach out to us directly, please do. I'm Ivy at motivationalmillennial.com, and Blake at motivationalmillennial.com, just to let us know what your thoughts are and what you'd like more or less of in the next year. Yeah, and it can literally just be sending us a couple sentences. You can shoot us a Facebook message. I mean, if you're listening to this, we want to know what you think, because we have a great audience, and it's a small core audience that's listening to all of the episodes. And so the fact that you made it this far and that you're caring about this means you're exactly the person we want to hear from. So please, just even if it's a sentence or two, and it could be anything, again, it could be format. We've talked about potentially just doing a content-based show where we're doing short episodes around a different theme each week, maybe bringing in some research or an article to talk about that's contemporary, or doing more guests and having to continue to be interviewed, but just changing the format or the focus. So really, anything at all that you can think of, we'd love to hear your feedback. I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for listening, and to thank all of our amazing guests that have been a part of this journey so far, and to celebrate with you, Blake, because we did a whole season of this. Woohoo! Boom! That's called grit. We don't quit. We've got to celebrate. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much, and we will be with you again in a couple of months. Peace and love. For show notes and upcoming guests, or to learn more about Coactive Coaching, the blog, and our other awesome offerings, visit motivationalmillennial.com. Keep in touch with us at facebook.com/motivationalmillennial. We'd love to hear from you. Shoot us an email with your thoughts, comments, and suggestions at podcast@motivationalmillennial.com. And tell us who you might like to hear from, or if you think you or anyone you know would be good for the show. The Motivational Millennial Podcast is edited by Christy Hostler and Team Podcast. Our theme music was composed and performed by Blake Brandis. Have a great week, Motivational Millennials!